Hello guys, welcome to the third video of this series where we'll be doing the motion breakdowning on government side for round 4 at Copenhagen Open. So the reason that I chose this round is I saw that there's a lot of teams failing on government side, and I think the win rate from opposition is 1.92 or something like that, which means that many people struggled to find the right government case in this debate in order to win. Now, I think this motion isn't that op heavy, and I think in this video I'm going to theorize as to I'm going to give a bunch of theories as to why I think the results were the way they were. Maybe this motion is a bit shallow on closing government and it's a bit hard to win from there. But I don't think that necessarily it should have gotten the score that it did. So let's get right into it. What's the motion? Again, I won't read to it, but this house is a global, as a major global power that we don't know which major global power, but as a major global power would not use predatory lending policies. Now, as per usual, what we're going to do is we're going to do a bunch of statement generation. You can pause the video here, generate the statements, and continue as if to see and compare what I was able to generate as statements. Cool. So basically, I have four-ish ideas on government side. There's probably some more arguments, but I think this is most of the things. The first is that the net economic effects are bad, and that you lose out more money than you actually gain this way, that you distance countries that can be in your sphere of influence, that you could use like in terms of building alliances and things like that with them, that you stop economic development, which trickles back to you, and that it harms your image in front of the wider community. Now, before we get into running these arguments, similarly to the opposition in the previous motion, we need to actually look at something that's very important that we need to analyze before we even go into arguments and things like that. And that thing is the setup of the debate, i.e. what alternatively would we do. So I would really recommend you guys do it now. So like you pause the video and think how would you would set up the debate. Obviously this is a bit more creative. There isn't one singular way of doing it, but you could later compare with the process that I have. So what kind of setup did I create? So basically the setup that we are defending on government side is that we'll still give out normal loans. And this is, I think, where some of the debate kind of loses out. Because if you don't necessarily point out to a stable alternative that you'll be comparing on Gov, then some of the arguments on opposition look a lot stronger than they actually are. So the alternative here is basically as follows. You'll still give out normal lending without necessarily wanting to harm the countries, because the idea of this predatory lending is to actually give them out loans which they can't pay in order to take their assets. So similarly to what like you know who is doing in Sri Lanka and taking the port there, or other such predatory policies. That's the idea. So what we would do is like we would still give out these loans. If we're still giving out loans, we still earn interest on the payment. We can still have like collateral. If they can't pay back their loans, we're just not doing it with the idea to get the collateral. We're just giving reasonable loans. And finally, we can refuse to give loans to some countries if they're too risky, because we're not trying to forcefully fail them in this type of things. So which all of these things lead us to a stance of continued economic cooperation. And here are examples, like for example, building a port in a country to accept our goods, raising the standards of living of people so that we could set up factories there, and things like that. So this is the stance that basically we can build up the arguments that we're trying to make. Because remember, when you're looking at the motion, this house is a major global power, would not use predatory lending. You have to then look at what alternatively would you do, and this is what alternatively we will do. Cool. So what are then the interests of the actor? The first interest that I was able to identify is that you have interest for long-term economic development. Why? Well, basically, are two broad reasons. The first is that you want to raise the standard of the living of your own people. The reason is that even if we're talking about an autocratic regime or something like that, you still are opponent to these people. These people can do a coup against you. These people can make protests against you and stuff like that. So you have some kind of legitimacy that you have to uphold to these people. Or if it's a democracy like the United States, their election, you want your party to govern long term because that's the specific interests within your party, or in general you care about your population because you're upholded to them. Or let's say that's not the case, you still want to have the ability to get taxable revenue so that you could spend this taxable revenue. It could be military spending, healthcare spending, it could be spending into specific technology and things like that. Now, all of this means that in order that this necessarily trades off with a short-term benefit that will come from the opposition side, where they, for example, can use the predatory lending, bankrupt this country in 2 years, and for example, take the port or take the mine or something like that. So this is something that, in analyzing the interests of the actor, we need to compare this incentive of long-term development versus this short-term benefit that we're getting. So basically, I was able to identify some reasons as to why we would care about one over the other. The first is that most likely you already have enough resources, but in the long term, these resources may go away. So, for example, like you may have like mines right now, but down the line they may deplete. You may not necessarily care about this thing that much. Or the other way of looking at this is to say, currently you already have enough money or enough GDP and stuff like that, so that you don't necessarily care that much about losing a port or losing a mine or something like that, but continuously raising this GDP and growing this is something that you would care of. So you will trade off short-term harms because you already have enough resources to take it versus the potential of long-term improvement to you. And this second thing is that the net effect will be greater. So in the end, you will have more money in, let's say, 20 or 30 years when you have developed their economies, and that later trickles down to you. That's something that obviously you have to prove in the case, but you could give it as an not as an explicit weighing here, even though you're implicitly doing it later. So you can point it out in the beginning of the speech. And finally, you just need people to buy your things. You don't need just resource extraction. You as a great power have a vested interest of developing these small poor nations, because later these people can become buyer personas of your products and services, which creates jobs for your own people, and that way we are all developing going forward. Bottom line, we will prioritize long-term economic development versus short-term gains. Now again, the question becomes, how do we achieve this? So here is something very important to do before we achieve this, is actually to look at some kind of framing here. This is an additional attack towards the case coming from that will most likely come from opposition, which is that the loan will always be bigger than the collateral. Because what is the case coming from opposition? It's going to be, let's purposely bankrupt these countries so that they're unable to pay these loans, so that we get their mines and things like that. So in framing, if you're able to prove that the loan that these countries you're giving to them is greater than, let's say, the mine or the port or whatever you take, you're already doing good pushback against the persuasiveness of their case. So why this is true? The first reason is no rational country will basically take this deal. Like if the deal is and there below there's an example, a mine as a collateral that's worth 600 million in terms of projected assets versus a $400 million loan, so 50% more in terms of the collateral than the actual money that you're receiving on the loan. No government would agree to this, because they realize that they are betting something more than what they actually gain in these type of things. Additionally to this, there's also interest on the loan. So the way this will work is the collateral will most likely be a part of the sum itself, but not the total sum or even close to that. So it most likely is somewhere around 30-40%. So you're in fact giving more to these countries rather than the collateral that you are receiving. The second thing is, even if these countries are irrational, irrationality has its own limitations. They, for example, have experts within the ministry, even if it's the most autocratic regime. You have a minister of finance, you have people in the government who still care about national interest and things like that, even if it's an autocratic regime, and would say, I think this is a pretty bad idea. The numbers quite simply tell that this is a bad deal. But even if there isn't like a group of experts in the government, there are like private interests, like for example local oligarchs who care about not losing the mine because they want to exploit the resources there, who will necessarily be opposed to this. Bottom line, then the collateral will always be less than the sum of loan that we're giving, which greater lowers the persuasiveness of the opposition's argument and increases the persuasiveness of our argument. So what's our argument? Basically, the argument is that this will lead to long-term economic development. The first burden that we have in this argument is to prove why will these countries develop from the normal lending that we offer them. There are broadly two reasons. The first is there are many things that can be built there that give direct return on investment. You know, for example, if you set up a lot of roads, it's easier for companies to, for example, transport goods, which means that, for example, it is cheaper for you to set up a manufacturing plant, or it's more convenient for you. If you want to modernize your infrastructure to reduce costs for business, like, for example, establishing a new electricity grid, new waste management system, new things like that, that has a direct cost-saving ROI that comes to yourself. Why? Because these countries are very poor, so their starting point is very low. So given that we can do basic things like this, these basic things have a great return on investment. But secondly, you can invest in things that have a long-term payout. So for example, invest in STEM education. After that, you, for example, after 10-15 years, you get a bunch of engineers within your population, which means that when companies are doing researches to invest in let's say, the country around this, they tell themselves, there is this amount of educated people within this country, let's outsource there. Or another illustration here could be, if you raise the standard of living of people. So like if people are not below their means right now through government subsidies, they're able to, for example, not turn into antisocial behavior like crime, which means that crime generally lowers, which means that now companies don't face such risks and they're likely to invest in these countries. Bottom line is, you pour money in these countries, they'll most likely get some kind of development going forward. Then the other burden is, why would this development trickle up to you? So there are broadly three reasons. The first is that the country receiver remembers this, so they want to do business with you. You become to them what is known as a trade partner. So if you've given them like a huge loan, and they're able to develop their economy, this generally strengthens the ties between countries. They start having things like, for example, business deals, like maybe tax exemptions for certain companies, like maybe when the business comes to the government to ask for advice where to invest, they're able to work as middlemen for that. So in general, they are able to increase the trade between each other. Secondly, you can still influence economic policy without bankrupting them. So you have to have a bit of more nuance, because this is kind of also what opposition is doing. The difference is, when you're loaning to these countries, you could set some what was the word for this? Conditions. Yes, that was the word. Conditions on the repayment without the explicit idea of bankrupting these countries. So for example, when you're making a repayment plan, you can as the country lender, you can say, I want this to be invested in these specific sectors because these specific sectors are directly in your interest. So that, like, let's say you want them to build a highway because now you can set up your companies there, or you want them to build an electricity grid because now you can, or 5G towers because now you can outsource your call centers there, or something like that. Again, the burden on op is to defend using conditions to strong arm and bankrupt them. The burden on government is to use conditions if this leads to long-term economic development. You could still say these conditions are likely to be lower in terms of what you demand, but they're likely to develop the economy going forward there. Or finally, you can also just outsource your companies there, hire locally. This raises the standard of living of these people, and they're able to buy goods, etc. Finally, you also have like more softer impacts, let's call it like that. So this is something that like you kind of noticed when you're, for example, traveling in Serbia. Like every time I drive my car around there, I see a lot. Their highway was basically built by China, and from that you could see that there are a lot of Chinese companies also there. So basically, the analysis is, the population in general gets accustomed to like having the great powers population there. it starts probably from business people, but then they put in some workers there. They start talking between each other, exchanging. It becomes more normal for you to buy, for example, Chinese goods or American goods or stuff like that. So overall, over time, it becomes your ally, and it starts buying out the things you have preferentially because they care about you. Now, the nuance here is, obviously, to a certain extent, they'll still do these things with other countries as well, but they'll always have a preference for you, for them. So what remains then? The impacts of this argument, which is that economic cooperation leads to increase of GDP, which later leads to taxable revenue, which then you can use for the spending, for any spending that you need, military spending, healthcare spending. You also raise the standard of living of your own people, thus they're happy, and you also gain other political power. So, for example, if you need their vote in the UN, they'll be able to also cooperate with you in terms of embargoes, fighting terrorism, but that will be explained more later. So, after this, we have to do the flip of the argument. So explain why, because debating is comparative, explain why on their side this doesn't happen. So basically, why would they be alienated on you? This is the flip. Asset seizure is extremely bad publicity. If a government gets like a port seizure or a mine or something like that, the local population will be very, very mad. Like, basically, what will happen is once they seize this asset, they'll have their workers there. It will be limited, controlled. They'll basically tell you you're not entering there, which really angers people because people believe that this is their birthright, that the resources of their country is their own. And secondly, the news is likely to propagate this in terms of how they stole the mines, how this is like an act of national treason and things like that. All of this will force the politician either out of office, which means that an oppositional party will come into power, which will be much more anti the great power that we're talking about. Or if the current government still remains in power, they have to do something, which means that they'll most likely distance themselves from you. This means that they're less likely to do economic cooperation with you, to generally be your ally, to take loans that you have. So all of the basically all of the developmental analysis that we had done so far loses out on their side of the house when you box these governments in to not cooperating with you, even if they want to. They won't be able to because of the bad PR stunt that this creates. But secondly, this also perpetuates a stereotype with other countries. So if a country is, for example, thinking of getting a loan with you or some kind of trade deal or something like that, other countries will not necessarily want to cooperate with you. It only takes usually one such event to happen, but it to be blown out in the media, for it to change the incentive system of actors who are evaluating to work with you in this type of case. Because the uncertainty of you creating problems for them down the line or seizing their assets is such a big issue that they will prefer not to cooperate with you. What are the harms of this? The first and most basic thing, this creates a lot of opportunity cost because you lose potential economic gains that you could have had you given this country a normal loan with normal standards. They were able to repay it and raise their economy, and you could work with them. Instead, you get this mine, sure, but as we said, number one, and here you could do the weighing, the loan that you're giving out is most likely higher than the mine itself, but also number two, it's less than the long-term economic potential that you have. Secondly, most likely there will be very long, protracted legal battles over the assets, which is an additional cost on you as the government, because the small nation will obviously try to fight back to a certain extent, like take this to the to an international court, and this to have it adjudicated there and stuff like this. Thirdly, finally, there is a scenario where they just won't be able to pay back to you, and they will refuse to pay back at you. Now, this scenario is not so likely because still countries want to cooperate to a certain extent. However, if this situation happens 2-3% of the time, the impacts are so bad because either you lose out of your money in total and you have to call off the debt, or you are forced in a very bad situation where you have to be an aggressor toward them. So this could mean, for example, you taking military action against the state, you pressuring them in other ways, causing embargoes, which deeply expands the amount of harms that we have in this debate in terms of wasting economic resources, lowering your image in front of society, and things like that. Then the conclusion is, on balance, it's much better our model of development versus their model of development. There are also additional harms to this. Even if you lose the economic clash to a certain extent, and OP still manages to prove, okay, but we still have more money on our side of the house, you lose out on your soft power as a great power in this case. And the soft power is basically the level of, how how should I put this, level of respect for more or less that the country has for you, and the more willingness that they have to work with you. So this is bad because for in a bunch of different scenarios. For example, military cooperation. When you're dealing with things like terrorist threats, narco cartels, enemy states. For example, when you want to use a country's airspace or their military bases, or you just want to basically use them as a place where you can put your spies in and things like that, they're less likely to do these things and less likely to help you in combating these types of organizations, which may ultimately cause you to lose lives in the future. These like threats are random. They like prop up randomly, and they're very directly opposed to great powers in general. So you have a vested interest to actually stop these types of threats, and you need countries on your side in order to do so. Secondly is negotiation. In many of these cases, if you have let's say a block of countries that want to cooperate with you, you can use them as opposition to other parties, let's say. So for example, if like the example here is how many countries don't cooperate with with US sanctions against Russia. Many countries in the global south don't do this, which like lowers the capacity of the US to actually do sanctions against Russia and things like that. So you're able to use this soft power of making them do what you want, which you can directly use, diametrically oppose other great powers that you have. Or finally, like if you just need them to vote for UN international institutions like the UN, where you may have a specific agenda. To be honest, this is kind of fluffy. I don't really know necessarily how to impact it, but maybe someone in the comments can do so. Okay, that's the case more or less coming from Gov. I think this case can, like, it should be able to win. I think that there are still like some problems with it here and there, but on balance, this should be able to beat the opposition's case because it's directly opposed to its impact, and you can still prove that there are other harms that comes with this, that you can weigh them off against potential economic development that the actor may care about more than they should. I hope this was helpful and was made it clear for a lot of people. Yeah, stay tuned for other videos.